Yeah. Yo, time to play, nigga. Alright. Let's see what the hell goes. Memories don't live like people do. They always remember you, whether things are good or bad. It's just the memories don't live like people do. Baby, don't forget me. Traveling man, moving through places, spaces time. Got a lot of things I got to do. But darling, I'm coming back to you. Baby boo, I'm a traveling man, moving through places, spaces time. Got a lot of things I got to do. But darling, I'm coming back to you. Baby boo, I'm leaving. Go ahead and leave the call heard around the world from the bottom. These cats is paying more than half a pound. I'm on my back and snatch it down. I got to say, but we can probably run them back in town. Scenarios like this is tear jerkers for the modern MC. I ain't a blue collar worker, cause this thing called rhyming no different from coal mining.
Good evening and welcome to Understanding the Roots of Racism, Transportation. At this point, we're pleased to welcome United Way CEO and President, Ann Mertlow.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our fourth installment of Understanding the Roots of Racism. In our first three sessions, we covered the topics of health, housing, and food insecurity. Tonight, we're tackling the topic of transportation. We're here tonight because United Way is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in everything we do in our community. In order to take the steps necessary to overcome the systems that grow and perpetuate racial inequity in Central Indiana, we must first understand the roots of the problem. We are hard at work to eliminate the barriers that prevent every person in our community from achieving their fullest potential, and racism is one of those barriers. Tonight, we're going to discuss systemic racism pertaining to transportation in the Central Indiana community. When you logged in, you saw a few questions on the screen to jumpstart your thoughts on tonight's conversation. It is our hope that upon the conclusion of this panel discussion, you will have a deeper understanding of how we got here. And even more importantly, you'll be inspired and know what next steps you can take to create positive change in our community. I too am here to learn. So upon the start of the discussion, I'll be disappearing from the screen and watching and learning at home alongside you. Before introducing our moderator, I quickly want to thank all of you who have logged in to join us in these conversations. Over the last 3 months, thousands have logged in to join these discussions and make a commitment to do your part to create a more equitable Central Indiana. Due to overwhelmingly positive feedback and requests we've received from attendees of past sessions, I'm happy to announce tonight that we're planning to continue this series in November and December with 2 more panels focused on understanding the roots of racism in education and financial success. And now I'm thrilled to introduce to you the moderator for our session this evening, Andre Franklin. Andre is a proud husband, father, and Indianapolis native. Andre works for Covance Central Laboratories as an IT senior manager and serves as a volunteer leader in various capacities around Indy. He currently serves on the United Way of Central Indiana's Board of Directors and as Chair Emeritus for United Way's Diversity Leadership Circle. Andre, thank you for leading this discussion. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Ann, for this opportunity. Hello and good evening to everyone. As Ann mentioned, my name is Andre Franklin. Very excited to be here with you all as we look to discuss tonight's conversation, Understanding the Roots of Racism, where we'll focus on transportation specifically. I think it goes without saying that the struggle for people of color to access public transportation has a long history. From Frederick Douglass entering a train car reserved for white passengers in 1841 to the 20th century bus boycotts in the South, which led to landmark civil rights legislation. Transportation affects where we live, where we work, where we play, and where we go to school. And it serves as a key issue in addressing poverty, unemployment, healthcare, and education. Tonight, we'll be looking at both historical and recent events that characterize how racism shows up in transportation with our panelists, and I'm humbled to introduce them now. We'll start with Inez Evans, President and CEO of Indigo. And next, I'll introduce Diamond Hargis, a roving listener with the Learning Tree. Next, we will have Kim Irwin, Executive Director of Health by Design and Administrator of the Indianapolis Public Health Association. Last but not least, Senator Greg Taylor, Indiana State Senator representing District 33. And for brevity's sake, we'll make sure that we go straight into our questions, but I want to make sure that you know all of their bios are available on the United Way of Central Indiana website if you want to know a little bit more about each of our panelists. So starting with our first question, I want to jump right in. It begins with, behind the public bus system is a long and complex history of closely intertwined with race and civil rights. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott of the mid-1950s, the Freedom Riders of the 1960s, Boston's busing crisis of the mid-1970s, when a court ordered that kids be bused across town to desegregate schools, How have these historical events impacted the current state of transportation for Black people living in the United States and in Indiana? And I want to start with Inez. Inez, will you give us your view on that question? How have these historical events impacted the current state of transportation for Black people living in the United States, Indiana, and Indianapolis?
That's a great question, and thank you for it. Definitely the historical aspects that you just spoke about have granted us, if you want to use that word, granted persons of color, African Americans, we're not relegated to sitting in the back of the bus anymore. You know, we have a quote unquote equal seat and we can sit wherever we want, but we need to think beyond the bus. The bus was just merely a symbol, a lens of the oppression that we were experiencing as a race. And we have to go beyond that. Decisions are still not being equitable in our country when it comes to the amount of funding that is being allocated towards transportation for persons of color. There's a systemic way that funding is used more towards highways and people who use cars than it is towards public transportation. Yeah, the average individual, you know, according to the AAA estimates that the cost of a vehicle is about $8,600 a year for a person to have a vehicle in this country. Persons who really need public transportation can't afford that cost when it comes to the car, the insurance, and all of that. So public transportation is a lifeline for those individuals in the community. And I think it's even more importantly that we've seen that during this historic pandemic that the essential workers were the individuals who were on those buses and who were needed to get to and from home, to work, and to important aspects around our city. So things have changed, but we still got a long way to go.
So very true. I think even as I think about my own childhood, I grew up in the 46218 zip code, and it's interesting now, fast forwarding to the work that we've just done in the city. The bus stops that I'm used to from 42nd and Post Road don't look anything like the bus stops that I see going through Broad Ripple heading downtown. And I know it's great work. I don't mean to demean it in any way, but it is very interesting to see neighborhoods that I've known for as long as I've been alive have not changed that much in terms of transportation, in terms of the quality of transportation, and even the aesthetic of what we're used to seeing. Yet, when dollars are put forth in certain areas, you can see a night and day difference.
You are absolutely correct. I mean, Indigo, along with the voters, and thank you to the voters who voted to say we want a better transportation system. You know, the red line was a $96.3 million project, and we're not done yet. We're putting $160 million into what we're calling the purple line, which will in effect transform the 38th Street corridor. We're putting over 50% of that $160 million is going towards infrastructure improvements, sidewalks, dealing with the flooding situation. I mean, Indigo is a bus company. We move people, but here we are actually having to move people by fixing sidewalks because it's all about accessibility. You know, you go through a lot of areas and they didn't have to fight to have sidewalks put in, but these communities, as you're explaining, we've had to put our bus stop signs in ditches because there's just no infrastructure in certain neighborhoods to make it safe for individuals to be able to access public transportation.
And so you bring up a couple of points, and we talked about this in some of our conversations, right? You think about the bus stop and the lack of sidewalks. It seems like a pretty straightforward, simple situation until you start thinking about aspects like those in our community who may be physically handicapped. So now I may be riding a motorized scooter down the sidewalk or down the street near traffic because there's no sidewalk, trying to get to the bus stop so that I can get to my destination. Some of this becomes just a safety issue that's solvable, right? And we see it being solved in other communities, just not always in communities where race plays a factor.
I totally, and you're so right. When we did a safety study on the Purple Line alone, it was shown that 415 situations of unsafe acts, incidents of collisions and fatalities would have been avoided by having proper infrastructure in place. So the Purple Line project is essential to be able to affect those changes and to be able to create that equity in those situations. I mean, we drive those corridors and we can see that the investment in those areas hasn't been put in there. A lot of it because, you know, decisions were made by whomever to not enforce having sidewalks put in by developers and things of that nature. I think there's a change in the culture of our city to understand the necessity to have those things in place because, you know, Indigo is only responsible to put the bus pad in, you know, a 6x8 bus pad, but we can't put in the bus pad if there's no sidewalk. That's what people don't understand. So this project and the projects that we're taking on, we're helping to change those things.
Absolutely. And thank you for the work that you're doing. It should not go without being said that it was enlightening for me to hear some of the things that you talked about even just now, right? That Indigo is responsible for part A, but is having to do parts B and C in order to make sure that people have safe access to transportation. So if no one else tells you thank you, I want to make sure that I go on record saying thank you for what you're doing.
No problem. It's a partnership.
Absolutely. Next question. A little bit of background. Today, race, socioeconomics, and transportation remain intimately linked. According to the American Public Transportation Association, bus riders across the nation are poorer and more likely to be of color than those traveling by car. Currently, more than 70% of the nation's transit agencies have cut service or raised fares, according to the American Public Transportation Association, having a disproportionate impact on the poor. What impact, if any, do cuts in service have on employment and access to jobs? And I want to point that to Kim and then come back to Inez to finish out. Kim, would you mind starting us off with that? What impact, if any, do cuts in service have on employment and access to jobs?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be with you this evening and glad to be with my fellow panelists. Jobs and transportation and many other things are intimately linked. We know that people's ability to get to jobs, to get to well-paying jobs, to get to jobs that match their skills and interests is directly connected to the types of transportation they have, transit as well as other options. And I think just a quick note on following up on Inez's comments. I mean, this is really about a system, a transportation network, right? A system that allows people to move around in more than one way. Unfortunately, we've built our communities for 50, 60, 70 plus years with the car as the single mode of transportation as priority. The Indiana Department of Transportation budget is still 96 to 97% focused on roadway building. And so these this funding issue, we've chronically and historically underfunded transit and walking and biking infrastructure. And so because of the interconnectivity of those, again, jobs and transportation and housing and land use and all of those things, we can't separate it out. I know Inez will probably speak more to funding and cuts and that kind of thing, but I think it's important for the audience to understand that in the state of Indiana, we have not increased funding for transit at the state level since 2009. So when we think about the increased demand that has come with not just growing population, but the change in demographics of that population, where that population lives, the fact that we've added transit providers over that time, but not increased the size of the pie, if you will, significantly undermines our ability to be able to advance transit service and to meet the needs of people.
Inez.
I can add that, Indigo's typical rider, according to a survey that we did in 2016, is an African-American aged between 35 to 49 years of age who uses that bus 3 to 5 days a week to travel between home and work. So just think about that. That is our most vulnerable population who's using our bus 3 to 5 days a week. It's their lifeline to be able to get to home and to work. I spoke earlier about the Purple Line, and just to kind of give you the statistics why that project is so essential to this community. The Line 39, for those who know Indigo, is our most heavily used bus line in our entire city. It's our heaviest. But the investment that we're putting in will add access to an additional 134,000 jobs that they don't have access to today. And 58,000 people, including a minority population of 61.6% and low-income population of 30.3%. That's what's going to be served by this $160 million investment. As Kim was saying, this city has been built very auto-centric. To be going into meetings sometimes and, to hear certain individuals saying, well, the bus service is for those people. It's for them. It's very disheartening, to hear them say, the buses are in my way. My people want to just be able to get into their Suburban and their Tahoe and just get home. That's very disheartening because it is public transportation. It is there for everyone. I am one of those people because I ride our system. I am one of them and proud of it. But we are that lifeline, that catalyst of change and equity. Our system is built on equity. I mean, we purposely put our services in areas of the greatest need. Indigo is built around equity. And to, be the movers to help to move the frontline healthcare workers and grocery store workers and people who are cleaning the hotels, et cetera, there's a need for us. If you go back, remember in the days of when you spoke about Rosa Parks, we were carrying the folks who were cleaning the houses. We may have changed the titles, but the type of work is still the same, that of the workers that are still on our buses.
And it's interesting, you talk about the employment aspects of it, and I think we briefly talked about this on our call as well, just pointing out, so I graduated from undergrad in the early 2000s, and I remember driving from Indy to Terre Haute, and it was cornfields once you got past the airport, really nothing. At the same time, I served in the Army National Guard, and I used to drive from a northeast side suburb out to Greenfield, all cornfields. What's common about both of those areas is you got the Indianapolis International Airport going towards Terre Haute, and then you've got the Mount Comfort Airport going towards Greenfield. So the thing I observed is these huge warehouses popped up over about a 10 or 15 year period outside of urban epicenters, but jobs paying $17, $18, $22, $24 an hour. Yet how are these people supposed to get to those jobs when they're that far outside of these urban areas where they might live on a regular basis, right? So it makes it a very interesting kind of duality of existence when you look at the city as a whole, because we're saying jobs are available, yes, but are they accessible? Those are two completely different conversations. And I think when you put a racial lens on it, it becomes very, very prominent. But without that lens, it just seems like this very macro, superficial, everything is okay because we have X number of jobs out there. People just aren't going to get them. And that's not always the case.
Very true. There's a lack of collaboration with a lot of our, minus Marion County, but there's a lot of lack of collaboration from a regional perspective when we're looking at, they're going out there for a reason. Maybe it's better tax base, maybe the land was cheaper, it's cheaper for them to build. But then there's a lack of collaboration with the transit systems, and that's just not Indigo. That's across our country. We do have an Amazon, but, we don't have the Facebooks and all of that like California does, where they can start their own transit systems to be able to bring their workers to and from. These are just the basic employment centers, and unless, our dollars can only stretch so far. The pot is only so big, and people may think that we can serve everybody, but we can't, but it doesn't stop a public-private partnership from taking place where that employer can help to defray some of the costs to be able to start a bus line to go out to their place of employment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to move on to our next question. And for our panelists, I want to start with Diamond on this one. I want to make sure we get him in the conversation. In 1957, Indiana announced its plans to use eminent domain and run Interstate 65 through the middle of Indiana Avenue neighborhoods in Indianapolis. Shortly thereafter, in 1958, the Department of Metropolitan Development released its redevelopment plans for the area, supporting the displacement of middle-class African-American families and businesses, devoting most of the remaining neighborhoods to an Indiana University medical campus expansion. So first, let's start this off with one quick question. What is eminent domain? Then we want to jump into what impact has this type of eminent domain as it applies to the interstate project had on African-American communities. So Diamond, I want to start with you there.
Well, probably Senator Taylor should answer the question about eminent domain, since this is political. But I really just, instead of just giving a history lesson, I just think that there are policies right now that's like policies back then that actually stop people from living their full life. And a lot of those decisions were made because of hate, white supremacy, if you might say. If we talk about systemic racism, we need to talk about policy and white supremacist policy too, that still affects young Black men in our neighborhoods, or people. I live in a neighborhood where that highway has ripped my neighborhood apart. So I think, what are we doing around policy, state and local, that shape opportunity for Black people?
So you make a good point. And let's back up so that we've got the right context. I'll start with the eminent domain piece, and then let's definitely get Senator Taylor in. So if I were to describe eminent domain, it is this idea that as a state or a local governing body, the agency, whether it's the state or a municipality, can decide that we are going to take over this land because this land's going to be used for some project run at a state or municipal level, even if folks live there. Now, people can be compensated for that land. They may not always be compensated for that land, but eminent domain is the idea that you could have a house, you could have a church, you could have a business, you could have anything in a particular part of town, and that land can be acquired by the state to do whatever it is that they want. In this instance, it is putting in I-65. So when we talk about Indiana Avenue, there's some historical context that needs to come into play there as well. Indiana Avenue served as the Black epicenter of everything for our culture, our community, for a really, really, really long time. What most people see now as the Madam Walker Theater, just one building sitting on a corner, had jazz clubs, had small businesses all up and down that corridor. Some of our best athletes that played basketball went to school at Crispus Attucks, which dumps out at the other end of Indiana Avenue. So this highway coming into a city as large as Indianapolis is, and this gets into a subject that we'll touch on later, it creates some distrust for African Americans in this city to say, why my neighborhood? Why where I live? Why this particular plot of land being taken in eminent domain? So with that explanation of eminent domain, Senator Taylor, can you talk a little bit about the impact of eminent domain on areas like Indiana Avenue, especially when we talk about I-65 coming in, knowing what that area was before the interstate came?
Sure, Andre. I think it's very important to understand and get a perspective on what eminent domain is, and maybe why it confuses people is because they don't know how to kind of relate to it from a personal standpoint. So let me start there first. Most of us who either have a home or are paying a mortgage on a home, we have a yard. And in that yard, there might be a sidewalk, right? That goes between your yard and the street. And then there's a space where you cut the grass and that sidewalk. Think of what we give to the city, which is an easement on that sidewalk that goes across our property as a taking or otherwise eminent domain. They take it forever. You don't get compensated in this position, but what it is for the betterment, quote unquote, of the community. Having a sidewalk there makes access down the street easier. So let me start there. And the whole premise behind the development of I-65 was for the betterment of the community. Well, as we know, at that time, that community where they took the land through eminent domain was occupied by a truly beneficial community to African Americans. So let's understand the platform and the base for it before we get into the discussion about why eminent domain is used to separate communities. So if you look at the area now, you've got a campus. And I think people miss this when they talk about eminent domain. We all understand that in Indianapolis especially, we have a lot of land that is taken for the purpose to be used by the government, be it if it's for a water utility, be it if it's for a university. The detriment to the community is not only the taking of the land, but in addition to that, that land is exempt from tax. People, you understand what I'm saying to you. Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis campus is exempt from tax. The city county building where it's located is exempt from tax. The State House where it is located is exempt from tax. I can keep going, museums, everything. And not only did they take the land, but then the land never contributed back to the community through tax revenue. That is a huge problem in the minority communities, and you see it across the country. In most urban cores, they took the jobs away and moved them to the suburban, what we call the suburban areas. Thus, those private sector companies pay taxes in those areas. In addition to taking the land, they moved the jobs and then said, now we're going to create housing that bunches you together, and now you got to get out to the jobs, which get to the transportation issue that we're talking about. If you can't see the systematic racism in that, then you're just blind. And I know there are people who are blind. I work with them. We're going to have a discussion. Inez talked about a $160 million investment in the Purple Line. Well, believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, there's already going to be a bill submitted by a legislator that doesn't even represent the area where the line is going to go to somehow stop that development from going down Washington Street, creating opportunities for people to get to jobs. So I think Damon, you're right. I'm the best person to answer that question, but here's the irony in that. The people who actually are going to make the decision don't even live in Indianapolis, okay? And Inez has already gone through, so for your listeners, has already gone through one session, legislative session, where we had to fight back a stopping of public transportation. Because, here's the reason, because they don't want dedicated lanes, they want shared lanes. That's what they said. I kid you not, it had nothing to do with the economic viability, had nothing to do with the fact that 68% of the people in Marion County said we want to fund public transportation. It had nothing to do with whether or not economically we could afford to do it. It has everything to do with some businesses on Washington Street determining whether or not they want shared lanes or dedicated lanes. So I'm gonna leave it right there because I can go on and on about that.
This poses a question. I was just thinking, Senator Taylor, and thank you for saying that. If people are on the outside making these decisions and we vote people in as residents, when do Black and brown people get to be at the table? Or maybe we should create our own table for this idea of having a conversation. The second, since this question was talking about like IUPUI have took over the Indiana Avenue and kind of destroyed that, we should talk about gentrification too, because Indiana's biggest economic development is through building and land wealth. So part of this shift around transportation also has to come to having a conversation and saying, why don't we cultivate, if we're really about interrupting racism, what can politicians do, city officials, to say, we've created an office for equitable development. So if this is about reconciliation, then how do we give back to the land to its previous owners?
Well, I want to challenge us to think about our civics class. The reason why legislators from outside the state of Indiana can determine, city of Indianapolis can actually determine what happens in Indianapolis is because we did some unique things with Indianapolis a long time ago. There is a law that says you cannot pass legislation that's special legislation. In other words, you can't pass a law for Allen County where Fort Wayne is located and not do the same thing for Du Bois County, okay? Indianapolis is what is called Unigov. So specifically through that creation, the legislators, of which there are 150, of which only 32 represent a portion of Indianapolis, so 118 other legislators can pass legislation to actually change and affect Marion County, Indianapolis only. So let's get that first before we start talking about how we can do what policies come through. We would love to have the ability to make policy and leave it up to the city county council to do it. The only problem is once they do it, Big Brother, the state of Indiana, and those 118 legislators who come to Indianapolis for 4 months and 3 months out of the year think they know what's best for Indianapolis.
So you're jumping into where our next question comes into play, and it comes in really, really well where Diamond had mentioned about land use. So I want to get that question out there so that we can keep the conversation rolling. So it says, we can't talk about transportation without talking about land use. Again, where Diamond just left us off. Planning, zoning, development, etc. What is their relationship in the context of racism and beyond? And how do we coordinate policy and practice to advance both while avoiding unintended consequences.
You want me to start?
I want to start there with Kim. Let's start with Kim, and I want to make sure we get Diamond in there as well.
I will keep my comments brief, other than to say that it is important that everyone understand how, again, intricately connected land use and transportation are. And I think one of the ways I've heard it said best is that we have unmet demand for walkable, transit-oriented spaces, right? And so when we build bikeways or we build sidewalks, people want that. It's attractive. All people want that. And yet it tends to happen in a way that it gets built and we end up with displacement as well. The aspect of gentrification that we don't want, right? We want to improve, arguably, we want to improve our neighborhoods. We want to make more walkable, more transit-oriented communities for everyone. It's the corresponding land use issues, the taxable land issues around that then leads to displacement, typically of communities of color, Black and brown people, and that, you know, creates this terrible cycle that we've seen play out over and over and continues to do. So I'll stop there.
Sure. Diamond, you said something that was really, really impactful earlier. You said the I-65 corridor has ripped my neighborhood apart. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, being that definitely it splits the council districts, right? Neighbors are actually can't receive the same services, and you got two different people making decisions for you. That's one. But I realized that even in its development now, we've been quality of life to death across the city. And one of the things that, because of the highway, CRA, we've been talking to some, as residents, we've been talking to CRA folks, and knowing that
What
was
CRA? Help me understand.
Community Reinvestment Act.
Gotcha. Okay.
And I know there's a lot of bankers on here, so just saying, I know people understand that Community Reinvestment Act, which really means a reconciliation, and where we're made to believe with the institutions that support us that they have our back by saying, what do you care about? Let's get your input. What do you think about transportation and sidewalks? All those things have been done for years, and yet we never really addressed the real thing. What action needs to be taken around policy again? I mean, I feel like a little bit of a disappointment where I don't feel like we can do anything. Though I don't feel that's true. So I think I want to offer an alternative to rethinking some of this, is one around allowing that the people who are watching have social capital.
Right. And so it's a very interesting intersection from our last question to this one, right? So you've got eminent domain where people who don't live in my house can come and take my house. But then you've got planning, zoning, and development happening in areas where the people are not represented by those making those decisions. So when we start talking about systems of oppression, right, I often tell people the concept of race can be big and ambiguous. But when we start getting really, really specific, systemic oppression shows up in this particular example right here, right? Where I wasn't involved, I wasn't at the table. Someone can either decide to take my home or part of my property, or someone can decide to rezone the area that I live in, or they can do nothing, the property values can decrease, and now I'm going to be gentrified, right? So when we start talking about systemic oppression, I don't want it to be this untangible, unrealistic thing, right? When we start looking at Indiana Avenue, great example of what gentrification looks like, right? My mom grew up in that area, and she doesn't feel comfortable over there anymore because nobody looks like her that frequents that particular side of town.
Also, I just wanted to say that I think part of what we need to realize in this is that there was intent around making these things happen. Yeah. I mean, that's what white supremacists is. And if there is intent now, so I've been in conversations, me and my neighbors, been in really interesting conversations around with people who make policies, and realizing that this stuff, that friends and social capital get worked into people on boards of big development corporations, and they get to make those decisions for other people. And I think that has to be addressed when we think about systemic racism. Who are on those boards that may be lobbyists or maybe coming downtown. Senator Taylor, how are you aware of that? And what community members in your district are we listening to, right? What do people care about that they already get off the couch and do, and not actually building the table for us, but actually being a part of the table we already at? We have good and we have really good ideas, right?
So here's Diamanda. First of all, let me say this. The energy, first you have to start with the fact that we first have to get people to realize that this was done on purpose. That's a huge, huge undertaking. And let me be the first to tell you, there are a lot of people who are not going to accept that as reality. So what you have to do, and this is coming from someone who's in a policy-making position, is show them how that decision, or the kind of the what you call the reconciliation, will help them. Okay? Now, starting there, you have to come up with a group of people. For example, in my community where I represent, I get contacted all the time about rezoning public hearings, right? For the redevelopment or renewing of liquor licenses. Liquor licenses come up every year. The renewing or the rezoning of particular pieces of property, which is under the land use plan. And the decision is made by a board of non-elected people, but they're appointed by those people, DMI. So what you have to do is what you said. You have to become part of that volunteer system to be on those boards. Why is it?
That's really hard if you're like low income.
No. Let me make it very clear. It is not hard to become part of a zoning board or variance board for the city of Indianapolis. You contact your city councilor, and directly to your city councilor, you ask them who is on zoning board A, B, C, D, E. Okay? And then once those appoint, and then they're listed, and when their term expires, because you can't serve over and over again, you put somebody in a position to take their place. That's how you become part of that land use discussion. Without zoning, they can't change the use of the property. They can't change it. And yeah. So
let me make sure I'm asking a couple of questions just to make sure everybody's got the right context. So what I'm hearing you say, I can reach out to my city county councilor, figure out what's going on, when those terms end, and when those terms end, I can say, how can I get a seat at the table, right? That's going to get me access to information. Am I playing that back right?
Yes. And remember, okay, so I want to make these signs bigger so people see them. You guys have ever seen those black and orange signs that says public hearing?
Yeah.
And there's a little phone number at the bottom. If you're driving, how you going to look and see it?
Right.
Those are zoning public hearing notices that have to be put not only into the roadway, but it has to go, a letter has to go to every, here's the key, homeowner in the area before a zoning is approved.
Now, I know why you're emphasizing homeowner, but why are you emphasizing homeowner?
Because typically we are not homeowners. We are not. And here's the thing. If you rent a house on 38th in Capitol, and you don't like the fact that there's a liquor store, a gas station, a tire station, a Subway, and they come up for rezoning, the letter doesn't go to you. It goes to the person you're renting from. But who lives there? So Diamond, and that's a whole other discussion about economic empowerment. But the point is, we have to become citizens that get information. When you see one of those black and orange signs, stop, write down the number, find out what zoning board it's going in front of, and get the neighborhood association to find out what's going on.
Most of those don't work, but I'm just saying for
You
immediate.
thought neighborhood associations?
Most of our neighborhood associations aren't as powerful anymore because there's always older folks on them. But listen, I'm saying median income in our neighborhood is $23,000. That means people working 2 or 3 jobs. I'm saying that we need to restructure the engagement process from that level to allow people to be. So don't get it wrong. Me and my neighbors are pretty powerful. If you want to know a good history lesson, read the Wild Styles Ethnic Cleansing of Indiana Avenue. That's a good history lesson. But I'm saying, what is action that can be taken so that residents, right, legal and non, can be involved in civic engagement, right, in a way that fits them. Like if you making $23,000 and got a family of 4, you're not gonna stop.
Yep. Well, like I said, the engagement comes from, like I said, there's a thing called Find My Legislator. You can find out who your city councilor is. You can find out, and the homeowners in the area have to get notice of any rezoning of land. That's what I'm telling you. It is, and then, like I said, you should know who's on zoning board. I believe there's 3 in Marion County, but each new zoning land use proposal goes in front of one of those 3 boards, and the city council and the mayor get appointments to those boards.
So there, I want to jump to our next topic real quick, and I apologize, I didn't get everybody in. We're going to jump to question 6. Congress provided $25 billion of COVID-19 emergency transit funding under the CARES Act, but public transit agencies still face a critical funding shortfall because of the COVID-19 pandemic. What impact has COVID-19 had on public transportation service in central Indiana, specifically communities of color? Kim and Inez, can you guys chime in here?
I can certainly start off. Indigo was able to be the recipient of $44 million that we are eligible to draw down over the next 3 years. Our budget normally per year, just to kind of put it into perspective, is between $117 million to $120 million a year, depending on, and that's just operating budget. That is not our capital budget. That's a whole separate bucket of money. So our operating budget goes to pay the operators, the mechanics, everybody who deals with the day-to-day service of putting on bus service. So because of the way our funding works, our revenue stream that we are getting today was dictated by taxes from 2 years ago, okay? So what happened in 2018 helps to fund me in 2020. So what is happening to Indigo or to Indianapolis today with work being shut down and all of that will be felt by Indigo in 2022, okay? So Indigo is putting the funding aside. We're reimbursing ourselves and putting anything extra into a reserve fund because our projections, to get to your question, are showing that in 2022, without additional relief funding, we will have a $30 million shortfall and we will have to cut 1/3 of our service. We're not unique in that because many transit agencies around the country are facing the same decisions. Now, the way their revenues may come in, their situation is more dire and more immediate than Indigo's is. You have cities like New York City, whose ridership just blows my mind, but they're laying off 1/3 of their workforce now because their funding, is just not coming through. Los Angeles is facing the same thing. Chicago facing the same thing. And I talked about the numbers of individuals who use our service. They're relatively the same. Anywhere between 50 to 70% of their ridership are transit dependent individuals, persons of color. Without COVID or CARES Act or HEROES Act, whatever act you want to call it, if there is not additional monies coming from the federal government, transit is going to fall. And in some cities, they're actually saying transit is going to go bankrupt and go away.
So Inez,
what happens then to the essential workers who need that service?
And you're going right to where I wanted to ask you. Can you talk about, just knowing that you're on calls with leadership across the country in transit, what are you seeing? What are the symptoms of what's happening in cities like New York? What's happening in LA? How is it actually showing up for Black and brown communities?
Well, one, mental health is become a tremendous issue. There is a rise of individuals who are seeking mental health, or if they're lucky to have the opportunity to seek mental health. Homelessness is on the rise. People may say that, you know, foreclosures and rent this and that is being held, but some landlords are finding ways to get around the rules and the loopholes, and many folks are being displaced. A lot of families are moving in with other family members. There's more calls for pantry. We used our excess capacity vehicles to provide services. We partnered with a couple of folks here in Indianapolis to do direct deliveries to homes to persons of color, because they simply didn't have the means to be able to even get to the grocery store to get their prescription medication. So if you can think of it, and we were still providing our level of service. Now, take away a third of that service, where entire communities, neighborhoods will be completely cut off, similar to like the Indiana Avenue story that we're talking about. The East Side, some of their areas of their ridership is so low, we shouldn't be providing service today. They will be some of the first ones to cut. They will be some of the first ones to cut. And so we're working on a strategy now to try and reinvent ourselves so we can not fall into that $30 million pit and be able to still be able to move our community forward. Other communities are doing the same thing. They are looking to reinvent themselves, working with their labor unions to renegotiate contracts, hold raises, do furloughs. They are trying everything they can because they understand the essential need that transportation provides. It's that lifeline to that community. Some folks just don't have another choice.
Kim, from a health administration perspective, when we talk about this COVID funding and where's the next support going to come from, what are the concerns that this raises for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. And I wish I had good answers to offer, but I think what I, again, will share is that it's so important, again, to be thinking about these things as interconnected topics and things that need systems approaches, right? What COVID has revealed, COVID-19 has revealed is, again, how, frankly, vulnerable too many of our residents and others are as it relates to housing, transportation, jobs and wages and sick time, childcare, and the role of the educational system and that kind of thing. We talk about conditions, community conditions of health, the phrase social determinants of health, I'll drop that with you all, but it really is about how our economic systems, our political systems, our environmental systems, all of those things connect to either work together for healthy people and vibrant communities or don't. And unfortunately, it's not that COVID honestly has changed anything. It's that it's revealed, again, how fragile the systems are, and that we don't have, here in Indiana and beyond, but we don't have the infrastructure in place from a public health standpoint, from a human services standpoint, from a broader, again, community development standpoint. We are really limited in the infrastructure that we have around people and organizations. And again, the work that we do, our capacity is low. We don't have enough people doing these jobs. We don't have enough money going into them. And so, you set up, we're in a crumbling system and we're just chipping away at it when we have this convergence of COVID and the recession and social justice issues and all of that.
Right, right. And so when we talk about this on the ground, right, let's get practical. So we know we have food deserts in Indianapolis. We know education is better in some sides of town magically than other sides of town. We know that jobs magically don't seem to be in certain areas. So when we talk about funding shortages, especially as it relates to what we're going to be looking at in 2022, to Inez's point, if we're not able to right this ship, it's not just that we're going to have a shortage of workers, which is absolutely going to be a problem, but we're going to have a shortage of the transportation services that get me to the grocery store that's no longer in my community, that gets me to my job, which keeps me a check, which allows me to stay in my place so I don't get evicted, right? So where we're talking about this particular topic, it's hard. Look, we're going to talk like we at the spades table. I said that when we were prepping. It's hard for me as an African-American from an African-American community to magically see this and not say somehow this doesn't seem to be affecting my friends in Carmel quite the same way as it affects the people that I know on 42nd and Post Road. It doesn't affect the people that I know on 38th Street. So magically, we've got a solution for it out here. But when it comes to these inner city communities, we're left with questions and a lot of education and a lot of socializing that we need to do. But magically, the funds seem to be somewhere else. I won't ask anybody. You guys have very important jobs to comment on that particular item. But I do want to take the opportunity as the moderator to point out that I think some things are interesting and keep us on time.
Wait a minute. I'm not gonna.
That's too deep.
First of all, I'm not gonna hide from that comment because you hit the nail on the head. And here's the irony in all of it. Nobody that has been a part of what have seen our budgets from the state of Indiana will say that they have been spending the dollars in the communities that need them the most. Here's the problem with what we do in Indiana. And we know it's going to get, you know how the community, they say we're at the space table, right? When white folks get a cold, we get the flu, okay? That's real, all right? And all COVID did was reveal that we had the flu. Now we had a cold when they were healthy. Now we got the flu and they got the cold. But remember, when they get a cold, they get the Robitussin. We get it again. We get, hey, we don't want this to happen to you, but hey, we're going to do something about it. We are going to feel, like Inez said, we're going to feel the brunt of this in 2022 through 2024. And I pray that all of the community leaders and everybody who are listening understand that right now, the federal government can give us as much cash as they want. But without the creation of economic opportunity, we are going to see a dip in 2 years in the communities of color. And if you think it's bad now, it's going to be worse because everybody else is going to be thriving and we're going to still be suffering. And that is a result of priorities and policies by our government. And it's just that simple.
There is also an alternative way to this. Is that, the way this conversation is going and saying that community don't really have no power. Now, the beautiful thing about Indianapolis, and I want to give a shout out to Pam Ross at CICF, that when you start to believe that everybody's gifts and contributions count in the community, what you just start to discover is that there are people who give their neighbors rides. And historically, like the jitney cabs, they have been outlawed. But despite that, to this day, you can go to any neighborhood. There's some young man or some young woman, right? The question isn't that community has or has not capacity to deal with these issues. I think the challenge is to shift the power structure to be able to open their eyes and see, to make the investments of the gifts and talents. But first you have to ask. Second, you got to want to believe that other people that don't look like you have these contributions, right? And so most of our policies are just despite that. But I think Pam Ross, she is one of the people I look up to that is probably a big policy changers that believe in the, not just in the inputs, but the things that grassroots people offer. So I think there's an example. So anybody that work in big institutions, how do you make that investment and start with your organizations to rethink that local policy? So, you know, instead of investing in all social services, invest in community cultivation, where the money go directly to the hands of the people. That is philanthropic, right? When we say that there are older Black men that can teach concrete, right, that might provide jobs, that get people to those hearing meetings, we need to figure out how do we funnel that money to go directly in their hands, organized, right? So I feel like that example to me is like seeing Pam do that work, what she's doing with the community ambassadors. That has been some powerful work that I've seen. So there is an alternative. Think abundantly, but act abundantly.
Inez.
If I can just say one thing, and Kim and Senator Taylor touched on it before, you know, besides the federal government, I'm going to implore to, you know, the folks here in Indianapolis who are going to be going to the State House. The senator worked tirelessly with other members of the party to stop the action that happened, you know, last year, okay? But as he indicated, another one is coming. And I want to make sure everybody understands the significance of that. The voters passed a referendum to say we want public transportation. But yet and still, members of the State House who think the service is for those people, and when I say that, I mean it was said to my face that the buses are in the way and the buses are for those people, and my people don't want those buses bringing those people to our neighborhoods. Okay? All right? Now, if that referendum, if he gets that through, that legislation goes through, transportation is cut before 2022. Transportation will be cut. The second thing is the State House forced upon Indigo a requirement to form a foundation to raise an additional 10% operating funds. No other transit agency in the country, in the world, is required to do this. Why? Set up for failure. Set up for failure to give them another talking point in order to slam us so they can say, see, they're not following the law. We didn't ask for this and we didn't agree to it. It was imposed upon us. And to Diamon's point, things are being imposed upon us. And when I say us, the community to which we serve, that we have no power and no say-so. 5 senators cannot change the will of the 100. And I appreciate the ones who stood by Indigo and fought to get this thing stopped. But they are coming at us with a vengeance this January.
So, all good points. And I want to make sure that we leave this conversation thinking about how we're going to look forward. One more thing before we get to that. This topic is obviously about more than public transportation, as many African Americans use cars to transport them to places no longer accessible in their community, which leads more contact with law enforcement. How did automobile transportation lead to the term driving while Black? What is its meaning? And how does that correlate to current racial unrest in the country? So, Diamond, I want you to jump in here as well as Senator Taylor, but I'll go ahead and talk about what driving while Black is. Driving while Black is a conversation that my mom had with me when I first started driving to tell me when you get pulled over, I want you to keep your hands on the steering wheel. I don't want you to make any sudden movements. Have your driver's license in your hand. Have your registration in your hand. Have your window down. Make sure your seatbelt is on. Do everything that would require you to make a movement before the officer gets to the car. Now, why is she telling me this? Because I'm an African-American man in a predominantly white country, in a predominantly white city. And at one point, we moved from the far east side to the suburbs. So driving while Black in that neighborhood very easily meant I could get pulled over just because people aren't used to seeing me there, and I gotta be there for the wrong reasons. I just so happened to be driving down the street in a neighborhood where the people don't look like me, therefore I must be up to no good. That is driving while Black. Senator Diamond, can we talk a little bit about how does this correlate to the current racial unrest that we see in this country? Not just downtown Indy and protests and riots, which I think were absolutely important, but around the rest of the country.
Well, right now, like if I got to drive in Indianapolis, I get a white woman to drive me around. So that's the safest. That tell you how deep that is, right? And there's a lot of that been going on, but here's how the reality on the ground is. I co-own a bicycle shop with a few of my neighbors. And one of the things we heard in like 2 to 3 days about the first wave of 60 people that didn't have their driver's license, all Black, 80% of them in United Northwest neighborhood. Come from other places too. In a week, there were 300. And none of them talked about being guilty or not guilty of the crime, but was talking about the reason they got pulled over. There were 3 people who were just pulled over in a parked car. So I mean, we can talk about historically, but right now I think, I say this, people come to me, a lot of folks come to us from higher up places and say, hey, how do y'all fix this problem? And I turn around and I was like, dude, you was just in the conversation with the policymakers, right? And so what we're still talking about is white supremacy when it comes to how our images. Black men are dangerous. It's just like modern day lynching. So what conversations can we have? Who can get us in front of the prosecutor, Mears, right? Who can get us the mayor himself? Because we want to talk.
Okay, so I'm gonna tell you guys, just candid, DWB is my biggest. I have had a bill every year, along with Representative Pryor, to stop racial profiling. Here's where we're at today. Okay, it's racial profiling. You can call it what you want. You can call it DWB. You can do it. The police officers are trying to catch you riding dirty. Okay, as we say in our community. I got pulled over for not making a right-hand turn signal, using my turn signal to make a right-hand. The cop drove down 38th Street, did a U-turn, came and pulled me over in front of my house. And the conversation went similar to this. Can I see your license and registration, please? Yes, officer, why did you pull me over? Well, back at Pennsylvania Street, you made a right-hand turn without your turn signal. Okay, here's my license and registration. Where do you have any weapons in the car? No. When you define weapon, what do you mean? I have a license to carry a firearm, if that's what you're asking. Well, do you have anything that I should be concerned about in the car? No. Now, realize I'm 2 doors down from my house. So at this point, my entire neighborhood is out looking because the lights are glaring. He had no idea that I knew his captain. So after he came back to the car with the warning, I said, on here, you didn't put the race that you get on the ticket. And he said, well, there's no race on your driver's license. And I didn't know we don't have race on our driver's. I challenge all of you to look at your driver's license. And I said, but can't you see what race I am? Well, that's not required. So I have legislation this year. First off, to change our driver's license, to put our race on the driver's license. Because here's what's happening for all of us who are for all these people watching. The police officers saying there is no racial profiling. And they can say that because there's no data, zero, to back it up. So realize that the reality that we're talking about here under DWB does not exist in the eyes of law enforcement. They only pull over people who are doing something wrong. For example, if you move from one lane to the other without using your blinker. Do understand that when they give you your driver's license and they give it back to you, even if they give you a warning, they don't have to fill out what race it's, and they have stopped filling it out. Diamond, here's the deal. If we get race on our driver's license, we will be able to compile, I'm not promising anything. We will be able to compile the data that shows that they are pulling over Black men at a clip that is almost 4-to-1 for our counterparts. And we represent less than 9% of the population. So we first have to start with policy, which the policy should be they should have to say who they're pulling over. Second, we have to address the issue with the data. And then we're going to have to pass legislation that says that if they have to show and provide those records to us. We don't have any records of it, but we can all relate to it.
Well, I get a question just throwing out there, just to hold this in the air. Who's holding when the governor making this equity commitment, right? I mean, one is in control.
Now, he made a commitment to have an equity person on his cabinet. Listen to the words. He did not make a commitment for. He has no commitment. The governor does not make policy. Listen to these words. Legislators make policy. The governor can either veto or sign policy. It's going to take the legislature to make the policy that he's talking about.
And who's holding them accountable?
Us, the members of the General Assembly.
So I got to jump because we got to get to this next question before we close out. Looking forward, how can transit be used as a tool to advance equity in Central Indiana? And I want everyone to have a chance to respond to this. Kim, I want to start with you. Looking forward, how can transit be used as a tool to advance equity in Central Indiana? Kim, please, your response. 30 seconds, please.
Sure. Yes, I think what we have to understand is that transit and broader transportation, walking, biking, all of it is critical in terms of improving opportunity through economics, education, jobs, all of that. I will name one of the things that was implied earlier but not said, and that is the mismatch we have in Indiana in our local income tax, right? We pay taxes where we live, not where we work. And that's a fundamental imbalance in Central Indiana in terms of revenue and how we can then fund transportation. So I think until we're willing to have some really hard conversations that not everybody has a vested interest in, right? Certainly, given the imbalance in the legislature, as it was said, and all of that, until we're able to get to a point where we can have some of those really hard conversations about financials and funding and how that money gets spent, we know what we can do. We have to have the political will and the civic commitment to get it done.
Inez.
It's about access and connecting. It's about, connecting and access to jobs, education, healthcare. It's about economic development. Look at the corridors and the spring up of infrastructure improvements that have already been done. It's about improving a lot of these neighborhoods when it comes to transit. And because it's not just about the bus, it is about the movement of our people, about our community as a whole. And I'm just adamant about that, transportation is not just about the 40-foots and the 60-foot buses, but it is how we can help move and connect people to that community, to new opportunities that help to move our community forward. We're catalysts for change.
Iman.
Well, I think one, we have to on the policy side of stuff, we have to get our politicians acting like real public servants instead of public masters. And the other is we have to really support public transportation itself is not going to do it by itself, as Inez said. community is an answer. Again, how do we invest in those who care about this by not just talk, but by action? How do we put money, time, right, and commitment to finding those people, put money to where that is going and letting them do their job?
Senator Taylor?
I think it's a real good question. And here's what I've learned in my years in the Indiana General Assembly. When I first started, I had mentors like Bill Crawford. I had people like Glenn Howard. I had friends who could tell me, would tell me, Greg, you're down here with a whole bunch of people that don't have any recollection or understanding what you're going through. So you're going to have to find common ground to actually get them and talk to them about how it's important for this to help them as well as their community as well as yours. So there are people who love transit, who want transit for a multitude of things. For me, it's about access and jobs and everything else. But for some people, it's about clean environment. For some people, it's about being able to socialize with their friends and do things that they weren't able to do before just in a car. So we have to all come together no matter what our reason for supporting transit is, and recognize that communities of color are going to keep growing, and eventually the day of reckoning is going to come and you're going to have to do something. So let's be proactive rather than reactive about it.
I would like to thank once again our panelists and as well our audience for joining us today for this very important conversation. It is our hope that each one of you has learned something new today, not just about us as individuals, but about the impact of certain forms of policy making that have negative impacts on those who may not be at the table. And I think it's only fitting, since Senator Taylor mentioned his name, I'll close with what our late Bill Crawford once said to many of us: if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. Please know that you will receive an email with additional resources as well as a link to register for the next presentation on November 18th, where we will be discussing education. Thank you to United Way for this opportunity. Thank you for our panelists, and thank you to all those who've attended. Have a good evening.